Hello and welcome back to another episode of Majlis and Markets. I am your host Hassan Javraj. Majlis and Markets brings you insightful conversations with influential leaders in Islamic and global markets. As usual, don't forget to like, share and subscribe. Email us too at our email address at hassan@majlisandmarkets.com and be sure to follow us on LinkedIn. Today, we're looking at Islamic finance in Australia. Islamic finance is gaining traction in Australia. With over 813,000 Muslims, about 3.2% of the population, there's an increasing demand for financial services that align with their faith. However, Islamic finance still makes up a small part of the banking sector, with limited options from major banks and a few non-bank providers. Change, however, is on the horizon. Australia has signed a free trade agreement with the UAE, its top trading partner in the MENA region, which opens doors for stronger economic cooperation. Now, the country is getting ready to launch its first Islamic bank. Leading this initiative is Dean Gillespie, CEO of Islamic Money Australia. With extensive banking experience and a commitment to financial inclusion, Dean talks about how this new bank could transform finance for Australia's Muslim community and beyond. Dean Gillespie, welcome to Majlis and Markets. Great to have you here.
Fantastic to be here, Hassan. Looking forward to it.
Dean, it's really a pleasure to speak to you again. I first reached out to you, I think, way back in 2021 or even
Yes.
2020 when IBA, or your current venture, IBA, Islamic Bank Australia,
Yes.
which obviously still in progress. But it was really fascinating reaching out to you and hearing about your story and hearing about how you're very involved in Islamic finance in Australia. But before we get into all of that, Dean, could you give our listeners your early life and how you got into banking?
Yeah, look, early life. I mean, I grew up in Sydney in Australia, and I studied economics at Sydney University, like many people, and then joined a bank. It was called Bank West. It was about the sixth biggest bank in Australia at the time, and sort of did corporate banking for a few years, but rapidly became a retail banker. And within a few years, I was running the mortgage business there and became head of strategy for the bank. And then the biggest bank in Australia, the Commonwealth Bank, bought Bank West in the GFC, and they sent me off to Hanoi in Vietnam, where I lived for about 2 or 3 wonderful years, running a retail bank there in Vietnam, and sort of came back then to run home loan sales for the biggest bank in Australia. And then since about 2017, I've been working on this really exciting project, which is obviously launching the first Islamic bank in Australia.
Fantastic. And just before we get into the Islamic finance part, what was life like in Vietnam?
Oh, look, it's just a beautiful country. The people in Vietnam are so lovely. The food, Vietnamese food, is very healthy. It's obviously a lot of really fresh ingredients, and obviously it's low cost. I think I lost a lot of weight when I was in Vietnam. It was a beautiful place to eat and to live, but obviously quite different from a Western market, and it's a developing market in Vietnam as well. So it's but rapidly catching up, I think, in Asia as a leading place.
And that was traditional bricks and mortar banking, not digital.
It was. Yeah, so it was called Vietnam International Bank. It had about a million customers, about 160 branches all over Vietnam. But yes, that was conventional banking. So, traditional credit cards, mortgages, home loans, all that sort of stuff.
Amazing. And then when did you first hear about Islamic finance?
Yeah, so around about 2017, I was approached by a group of people wanting to start the first Islamic bank in Australia. It's a group of 13 people. They're all lovely. I know them all very well. But they weren't bankers, so they sort of called me up and said, "Look, would you mind helping almost on a volunteer/consulting basis to help us build the first Islamic bank?" So I suppose that was my first, real exposure to Islamic finance. But I've lived Islamic finance in Australia since that. I think for the last seven years or so from there on. But even from the start, I just thought it's such an important thing for the community that we get this bank up and running. Given you've got such a large Islamic population in Australia, and yet there's no Islamic bank.
Yeah, no, I was looking at the figures of the census for Australia, the Muslim population, and obviously
Yes.
it's grown a lot over the past, say, decade or so.
Yes.
And it seems like as you've said, right, there is a growing Muslim population, and there is a need for these financial services. Why do you think there haven't been any efforts before you guys to launch a bank like this?
Yeah, look, I think part of it would be relating to the size of the population in Australia from an Islamic perspective. So, I mean, Islam is the fastest growing religion in Australia. It's also the second largest religion after Christianity. I mean, it's growing at about 6.1% every year. It's about 1 million Muslim Australians at the moment. It's about 3.2% of the population. So I think if you went back 10 or 15 years, you just wouldn't have had the scale in terms of the customer base or the market size to be able to launch Islamic banking in Australia. Whereas now you've got, a very, very much a growing population. I mean, Muslims in Australia as well are quite a young population. 85% are actually under the age of 50. There's a lot of 20-year-olds and 30-year-olds and young families, having kids, etc. So we expect it to continue to grow. But if you went back 10 or 15 years, you probably just didn't have that size of customer base. Whereas now that it's grown so strongly, you look at other markets around the world, and it obviously just makes complete sense for there to be an Islamic bank now in Australia.
And have the incumbent banks, do they offer rather Islamic products, or is it quite scarce?
No, so there is one bank, which is National Australia Bank, or NAB, which has an Islamic window, but not retail. It's only for large commercial deals. There's 4 big banks in Australia. The other 3 of them don't do Islamic finance at all. We do have small non-bank financial institutions that do some Islamic finance, like Islamic mortgages, etc. But there is no bank. And the difference in Australia is a banking license in Australia basically means you can take deposits. So the technical word for it is an authorised deposit taking institution, or ADI. You can't take deposits in Australia without that. So those small Islamic businesses have not been able to offer the full featured service, which is what we're building, really. We're building a fully featured retail and business bank for the first time, offering things for the first time like savings products that will offer profit share instead of interest.
Very good. And Dean, you think you mentioned about these young people needing financial services. So
Yes.
are they not part of the, would you say they're not part of the current financial ecosystem, or do you think they just take a conventional and
Look, I think it's a bit of a mixture. I think certainly, in Australia, we're quite the world leaders in Australia on payments. We had contactless before anyone else in the world. Effectively, if you're an Australian person that works, you have a bank account. So, even if you're a Muslim, you're probably got a bank account with an Australian conventional bank. It's quite different, though, for mortgages. I mean, we certainly hear stories all the time, and we get contacts on our waiting list all the time saying, I'm just not prepared to get a home loan from a conventional bank in Australia because of the rebate. It's not in line with my faith. So, we were on the national broadcaster not long ago on the news, and they interviewed a couple that had moved, I think, house 10 times in 10 years because they keep renting. They refuse to get a mortgage from from a conventional bank. So, I think from that perspective, it's really critically important for the community that we do this and we do it well.
And this is not specifically to Muslims, right? It can be for everybody.
No, absolutely right. And again, we have a number of people come to our waiting list that are not Muslims, and they potentially might have been an Australian expat that went over and lived in the Middle East and was exposed to Islamic products in their time over in perhaps Saudi or the UAE. And then they come back to Australia and they say, look, we just really like the ethical nature of the products, the partnership model that comes with Islamic banking. And indeed, I did a radio interview not long ago on the big talkback station in Perth, which is 6PR, and talked about how Islamic finance works, just explaining it to the general community. And apparently the switchboard just lit up with people saying, this is absolutely fantastic. We need this sort of banking in Australia. So, I mean, even from a regulatory perspective, we can't discriminate on the basis of religion in Australia. So we're open to everyone anyway, but we'd be really excited to be attracting, non-Muslims to us as well. And I think even if you look at markets like the UK, where I think a quarter to a third of the Islamic banking customer base or the customer base that banks with Islamic banks are not, of the Islamic faith, we would expect to see something similar in Australia as well, because the Sharia compliant, the ethical nature of the products just makes them so much more attractive, I think, to the general community as well as Muslims.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you on the UK, we obviously in the UK, where I'm based, we have quite a well-established Islamic finance
Yes.
industry. Been here since
Yes.
the 1970s, 1980s, and it probably really only took off with HSBC Amana, I would say, in the
Yes.
mid to late 1990s, and then
Yes.
you had a lot of regulatory changes which were done over the early 2000s, and then up until the sovereign sukuk in 2014.
Yes.
Uh, but Dean, like really speaking, if you talk to people anecdotally, Muslim communities in the UK are at the lower end of the socioeconomic ladder.
Yes.
Uh, they pretty much excluded from the financial ecosystem. And to be honest, Dean, like when I talk to my friends or I talk to people in the market or I talk to people anecdotally,
Yes.
but they're very skeptical of Islamic finance. They at the same time they also find that Islamic products are not competitively priced.
Yes.
Um, would you say Australia may go through the same challenges as the UK?
Look, I think we'll certainly have to face into some of those challenges, and some of those come from the challenges of regulation because we haven't had Islamic banking products in Australia before, and so there's certain things we have to do to work around those. I think from a competitive, your question is absolutely right in the sense of people will be moving to Islamic Bank Australia from other banks largely, which means we have to not only be price competitive, but also experience competitive. I'm talking about like digital apps and making sure that we provide a really nice, pleasant banking experience. I mean, the one thing I would say, people generally hate the big banks in Australia. It's almost a national pastime bashing big banks, and I'm not making a comment on any of that. I'm not going to say anything, but it's certainly a lot of people complain about the service that they receive from the big banks a lot. And so we would obviously hope to provide much more of a friendly experience. And, certainly I've always said to my staff that we need to respect our customers and do the absolute best, try and act in good faith at all times with those sorts of things. But certainly the regulatory challenges we have in Australia have been something that we've had to work through. So I know you're in the UK, the UK passed legislation I think in the 90s or earlier to exempt Islamic finance transactions from things like double stamp duty. So when you buy a home in Australia, it's you have to pay a stamp duty when you transfer property from one person to another, and it's actually only Victoria, which is the state that Melbourne is the capital of, that has a legislated exemption like the UK to exempt transactions from getting double stamp duty, because as you would know, if you do particular types of transactions, like a diminishing mashara, for example, there is a purchase off the person selling the house to the customer and the bank at the start, and then obviously the customer is then buying it off the bank over time, increasing their share, the partnership in that. So that can sometimes attract double stamp duty. So one of the things that I've done over the last few years is I wrote to all of the state and territory premiers. The premiers are the leaders of the states in Australia because stamp duty is a state-based tax, and there's 8 different jurisdictions across Australia. And I called for reform in these areas. And the good news is that a number of those states and territories have now changed and are now exempting these. But I'm still working with the biggest state, for example, New South Wales, which is where Sydney is, to try and get that resolved as well. So it's a bit of a journey. The other thing that we've done is I was the chair that founded the first Islamic Finance and Investments Association in Australia. We got together the CEOs of some of the biggest Islamic finance companies, and we formed an association now that can really represent Islamic finance formally across Australia. So it's baby steps, Hassan. We're getting there. We're ticking the box, but all of these things are just challenges that you've got to overcome before you can, really do this properly in Australia.
Yeah, not to get too political, but do you think like a lot of this, like in the UK as well, like we had a lot of people in different stakeholders. So, for example, we had Baroness Warsi, who was in the government at the time. We
Yes.
had Mervyn King, who was quite pro-Islamic finance, who was the central bank governor at the time. And we had other people in different institutions which are quite favorable towards Islamic finance. Do you think like in
Yes.
Australia, there is political will to facilitate Islamic finance?
I think there is actually. I mean, you've got a situation at the moment where it's also a rapidly growing community. And I suppose politicians like votes at the end of the day. And it is as I said, it's a very fast growing community in Australia. And so, certainly we have found the Australian government to be very supportive in terms of what we're trying to do. I mean, we deal with the regulator, the banking regulator in Australia is called the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority, or APRA. APRA had been very supportive of us in working with us to try and get around some of these issues. And some of these issues are historical issues, like the Banking Act, is actually in Australia, which governs banks, it was originally written in 1959. It's been amended since then, but nonetheless, there was no real thought of Islamic finance when that act was put together originally. So that means that as we've tried to build a bank for the first time, we have discussions like, well, is an Islamic term deposit or investment product, is it an investment product or is it a deposit under the Australian legislation? Because a deposit is generally a debtor-creditor thing at a conventional bank, as opposed to an Islamic term deposit like you might get from Al Rayyan, perhaps in the UK. So we've had to go through all of those sorts of things with the regulator. But in all of our conversations, we have found that the government has been incredibly supportive, and the regulator has been very helpful. We've certainly from our side of the fence, we've got a great relationship with APRA, we would say. And so, these are just little things. And the pleasing thing, I think, from my heart and from my team's heart is, we would hope that in time there are more Islamic banks in Australia than just us, because, we're certainly open to competition and providing a great service. But if we can solve these problems now, it almost makes it easier for everyone else in the future.
Why do you think a lot of the Malaysian Islamic banks or the Gulf Islamic banks, like Dubai Islamic Bank or Kuwait Finance House, I know they've been withdrawing from a lot over the past couple of years, but why do you think some of the larger, more established Islamic banks in the world haven't gone to Australia?
Look, it's a really good question, and we find it quite surprising. I mean, certainly, I'm doing a capital raise right now, and we do occasionally get feedback from investors that, Australia, it's just a long way away, which I always find quite surprising because we do actually have technology nowadays and email and, you can get on video calls and things and it doesn't feel that far away. But you just haven't seen any of those large entities try to come into Australia. I think the other thing I would say is we are very well known in the Islamic community in Australia as being the banking, I suppose, candidate, or the candidate to be the bank. So there's not really another company that's trying to do what we're trying to do, because everyone in the community is trying to support us in trying to get this bank up and running. So, Australia is a different market. It's a very good market, though. I mean, as I often say, it's a triple A rated market by all three, Standard & Poor's, Moody's, and Fitch. I think there's only 11 countries in the world that are AAA rated. So it's a great economy, and it's a very well regulated legally economy. So we are a little bit surprised that no one's come in before, but we're very much hoping that we get in there first.
Dean, I've got a question for you. It's kind of twofold. The first is, in all markets, even in developed Islamic finance markets, one of the challenges I think a lot of players face is the lack of awareness or the lack of understanding of products. How do you think Australia is doing in terms of educating its customers? And then the second part of the question is, like I said before, there's a lot of criticism of Islamic finance in the UK about its performance or its price. And I know in Australia there are some entities which have come under a little bit of criticism from some of the community members. How do you think the industry can address some of these issues?
Yeah, look, I think there's a few things there. I mean, from a competitiveness perspective, we are aiming to be price competitive with the other banks, notwithstanding some of the legal structures that need to go with. Obviously, there are different legal structures that underpin some of the contracts and the transactions that are happening. Part of what we're trying to do in that space is, really lift the standards of everyone across the Islamic community. I'm not saying that there's not good entities out there. Everyone, I think, is doing their best in Australia at the same time. But that was one of the reasons that we actually formed the Islamic Finance and Investments Association. Was we wanted to try and ensure that actually we had a good benchmark upon which all Islamic entities in Australia could be, could compare themselves and make sure that we were operating to a code of conduct, that all of those entities were sort of signing up to a code of conduct that was appropriate, because we want to make sure that, in any economy, it doesn't matter what business line you're in, any industry, you're always going to get a few bad apples in the industry. That's just the way that these things work, unfortunately. But we want to obviously try and minimise that in Australia. And I think from an education perspective, look, that is one of the fundamental challenges that we're having to work through at the moment. So, 40% of Muslims in Australia were born in Australia. So by definition, they probably have not ever seen an Islamic product before. And if you talk to them about Murabahas or Mudarabas or diminishing Musharakas or Ajaras, they probably don't know what they are. So we've had to actually spend a fair amount of time, creating explainer videos on our website so that if people come to the website, they can see, oh, actually, well, this is how an Ijara works. This is how that transaction is different. But certainly there is a lack of awareness, I think, of Islamic banking products, or certainly a lack of understanding in terms of how that works. And that plays into, a broader question of financial literacy throughout the Islamic community in Australia. But that's something that we would hope that we can, not just the bank, we certainly would drive it within the bank, but we'd hope that we could actually work with the other Islamic businesses in Australia as well to try and drive that, very much in Australia.
From your perspective, somebody who's trying to create an Islamic bank or an Islamic financial institution, how difficult is it to create true Islamic products? Because when I've talked to Islamic bankers over the years,
Yes.
some of the things that they say is like, look, we're trying to play football in a rugby pitch. It's kind of difficult.
Yes.
We're the different sport to how the market works. So, for example, if you as the banker, how would a Mudaraba account work at your institution?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a really good question. So one of the fundamental questions which I touched on before is, is it a if the capital is at risk, we take the capital off a person, and obviously, in a traditional deposit at a conventional bank, there's basically a guarantee that the bank will return that. It's a contractual obligation that it's a debtor-creditor relationship in that sense. That's one of the things that we've had to work through is if we do a profit share based transaction, it's less about the profit share. It's more about the fact that the underlying capital is at risk in a Sharia compliant transaction. Does that still meet the, I suppose the legal standard of being a deposit, or is it a investment product? But if a term deposit, as you would know, at an Islamic bank in somewhere like the UK, certainly the profit share component of it, we would track through P&Ls and we make sure that we have an expected profit rate and share or a profit sharing ratio, depending on the nature of the product that we're doing. But the challenge with it is more the underlying structure of the transaction and whether or not that meets the legislation. So it's certainly been a challenge, and it's something that we've had to work through in terms of how that works. But as I say, we're doing these products for the first time, and there's very much acknowledgement from, I think, the regulator that, you do have 1 million Muslim Australians now, and they have a desire to have these sorts of products that are available. And so I think everyone is doing their best to try and make them work within the regulatory framework that we have.
With regards to the Muslim population in Australia, like in the UK, like I've heard people talk about, there's 3 different kinds of Muslims that you get. You get the Muslims who are very like affluent and who don't bank Islamically. You get the ones who are very religiously devout, will pay over the odds for the product. And then you have young people who have no money, basically, and the ones who are like these people on TikTok and Instagram and social media. How are you going to mitigate? Is it the similar situation in Australia, and how will you mitigate and try and attract these different kind of customer bases?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think part of our proposition is, we by nature will be the first Islamic bank in Australia. So by nature, we will be the first ever bank in Australia that does not deal with interest or riba anywhere in our ecosystem. So, that's the first customer proposition. But I think coming back to what I said earlier, you need to be competitive both on price and on experience. And I think if we launch and we are, percentage points on our rental rates higher than what someone can get at a conventional bank, particularly, the cost of living is an issue everywhere, but cost of living in Australia is growing quite a lot. It's something that stresses a lot of people out in Australia. So if we go into the market and we are not competitively priced with others, I think we would almost not burn bridges, but it would be very hard, I think, to claw that back, because people go, oh, the Islamic Bank Australia, it's too expensive. I won't get there. However, on the flip side, if we go there and we are competitive and we've got a great app and it's really easy, and we're building it so that you can literally just download the app wherever you are in Australia and scan your driver's license or your passport and instantly get your account and card with Google Pay, Apple Pay, etc. So we will be competitive digitally. Then I think we've got a great chance of obviously, attracting people across to us. So look, we're not from a marketing perspective into those different segments that you mentioned, which are quite correct. We're not running big above the line campaigns with giant radio or television campaigns or anything like that. We're having a very targeted marketing approach. Muslims in Australia overwhelmingly live in Sydney and Melbourne, and that's a function of that's where when immigrants come to Australia, they are the two largest cities. They tend to land in either Sydney or Melbourne. But you do have communities of Muslims in places like Perth on the west coast of Australia and Brisbane as well. And so we have to build a digital experience that means we can't open branches everywhere because Australia is geographically an enormous place. And even most banks aren't opening branches at the moment now anyway. So we've built everything digitally as much as possible. But we would be hoping that by getting the message out there through the mosques and on the very targeted, SBS Arabic, which is the radio and the TV station that broadcasts in Arabic in Australia, we hope that we can get the message out there and attract people through that. But you're quite correct. I mean, we have to focus very hard on ensuring that we can actually get people away from the big banks and across into the Islamic bank as easily as possible.
And then what's like the current status? Because I think you did try to launch in 2022 or 2023, but what happened?
Yeah, so look, it's been quite the journey. So we completed our first. So let me step back. We were always going to raise $60 million to launch the bank, and that was always the plan. And the plan was to do it in two chunks. The first $20 million, which we successfully raised, was to build the bank, and then the second $40 million was to really launch the bank and provide the capital that we need, the prudential capital to be able to enable us to sort of start writing home finance and business finance. So we've actually built the bank. We've got debit cards that I've got one here in my wallet, and we've got a SWIFT code. We've got a BSB, which is like an Australian bank sort code already. So we've built the bank basically. But that second 40 million, we were hoping to raise that last year. And unfortunately, the capital markets have just been really tight, we've found. And so that was delayed. And so that's what we're still trying to actually raise that 40 mil. But as a result of that, we handed our license back to the regulator proactively in March this year. And the reason for that was there's a minimum capital threshold that you have to hold to maintain a banking license. And we were going to drop below that because we took the decision to keep building the bank. But unfortunately, that meant we're going to fall below the threshold. So we went proactively to the regulator and we handed the license back without having any breach, which meant that we can just reapply again when we've got the cash. So, we were aiming to launch probably around about now, but unfortunately, because of that capital raising delay, we're just trying to complete that capital raise. And then as soon as we've done that, we'll be aiming to launch as soon as we can. We'll have to get the banking license back from the regulator and obviously try and launch. We would hope sometime towards the end of next year. So it's a little bit disheartening, but as someone once said to me, as it says in the Quran, Allah never burdens a soul with more than it can bear. So we were all very disappointed to hand the license back, but no one has given up. We absolutely want to deliver this for the Australian Islamic community.
Very true. And I think when you and I spoke when I was writing an article a few months ago, that you said that like a lot of Islamic investors, especially like in places like the Gulf, they weren't too familiar with Australia. Do you think Islamic finance and by extension your venture can help them understand more about Australia?
I really think so. That's a great point. I mean, I mentioned before that we are AAA rated in Australia, and so I've often gone into investor meetings in the Middle East, and they've said, "Look, we just don't know Australia. It's so far away. We're used to dealing with Europe. We're used to dealing with New York, but we're just not familiar with Australia." And I think one of the things that I'd note is Australia actually has a raft of Sharia compliant investment opportunities. We have a lot of infrastructure projects, asset-backed projects. And I think one of the challenges that we've had up to now from feedback that I've had is that there are Islamic funds offshore that would love to invest in some of these projects like airports and bridges and roads, etc. But there's no way currently to get funds into Australia without those funds going through a conventional bank and commingling with, it could be money that's come in from, pornography or alcohol or pork or whatever. And so one of the things that we are very much hoping that having an Islamic bank in Australia will mean is that we can unlock those trade flows and those investment flows into Australia. So because they'll have a conduit, they can do a SWIFT transfer or a wire transfer into the Islamic Bank of Australia. We keep our ecosystem clean from the perspective of riba and even from away from the haram industries. And then that money can flow out of Islamic Bank Australia and it can go into the airport or into the bridge or whatever it is that they're wanting to fund. So we actually think this is a really exciting moment. We're trying to set up the Australian. We'd love to be the sort of Southeast Asia's Islamic hub if we can get Australia working right, because Australia, obviously, we're a very well-regulated legal environment. Banks don't collapse; they're incredibly well-regulated. We've got a very good regulator in Australia, but the legal environment is great. So there's a lot of incentive, I think, and I think over time, as we launch the bank and we hopefully drive some of those flows, we would hope that other markets around the world become more familiar with what we're doing down under.
As we bring the podcast to a close shortly, Dean, there was one thing that just came to my mind. I wrote an article about a couple of weeks ago about this new AOFI standards. I mean,
Yes.
They're talking about, like, the standard basically proposes that a complete overhaul of the Sukuk market.
Yep.
Just I'm not talking about Sukuk too much, but like, what are your thoughts on this shift from, say, form to substance? Are you in favor of that as someone who's trying to build an Islamic bank?
Yeah, look, I think the more guidance we can get from AOFI on these things, the better. I mean, it's certainly that shift. We've been. I mean, there's not much Sukuk in Australia at all at the moment. It's very new, and obviously one of the challenges is, I've talked about us raising capital, but we've also got to raise debt finance for things like home finance and business finance. And so one of the options there, of course, is Sukuk and amongst other structures that we could use. But certainly, in building the bank, we've aimed to align with AOFI standards as much as is possible, except where we can't under regulation for specific things. But we would hope that the standards are they're pretty. If you ever read the AOFI standards book, which I have done, it's quite good. It gives you a lot of guidance, but equally, once there are new standards, we always want to check them as well and make sure that they are clear, because we then have to try and sometimes massage them a little bit to make them work in Australia. But that's just one of the challenges of doing this for the first time.
And beyond banking, Dean, there's also like things like, I think it's called Supra, like pension management in Australia. So there are
Yes.
options for
superannuation. Yep, super. Yep.
For investment services, there are opportunities. Are you looking to tap into these kind of like ancillary services as well beyond banking?
Yes. So when we first look, our aim when we first launch is to launch a bank, which is obviously the first retail and business bank. So that's the focus early on, because you do actually have other providers already providing, for example, Islamic superannuation funds. So whenever someone works in Australia, for the benefit of your listeners, 11.5% of that has to go into a superannuation fund to basically fund pensions and old age retirement. And so there are Islamic funds that will only invest those funds in sort of Sharia compliant or ethical products or revenue generating products. But because there is obviously they're a subset of the general community, one of the things that tends to happen is that the way that they are often judged versus conventional funds, which have the ability to generate higher returns. So one of the things that we are wanting to speak to the Australian government about is the fact that you can't really benchmark an Islamic fund in the same way that you can benchmark a conventional fund, because that you have a restricted, sort of asset classes that you can go into with an Islamic superannuation fund. So, these are some of the other parts. I mean, we're not going to wake up tomorrow and do superannuation. I'm happy to speak to our good friends at some of the other superannuation funds in Australia about how we could do that. The other one that is a bit of a gap in Australia is there's no takaful in terms of insurance. So, we're working quite closely with some parties around introducing takaful into Australia for the first time, because if we do home finance in Australia, we generally require, all banks in Australia will require that you take out insurance over that property, but we're reluctant to push people into conventional non-Sharia compliant insurance products as part of that, doing a home finance transaction with them, for example. So it's just, as I say, the market is developing every day. There's a lot of these exciting opportunities. Our focus is on launching the bank, but absolutely we want to support other businesses in delivering those other services as well that are critical for the Muslim community.
Fantastic. Dean, tell us more. Well, I guess you've told us a lot, but tell us more about your upcoming projects that you're working on.
Yeah, look, there's just so much to do in building a bank. I mean, certainly we're trying to pull everything there together. As I say, I'm involved with this, the Islamic Finance and Investments Association, where we're certainly aiming to lift the profile of Islamic finance. And as I said, it's not just us, that's us working with other Islamic finance businesses around Australia as well to try and do that. And if we can launch some of these other products like takaful and and try and market things like superannuation and get good understanding for the community around those things and lift financial literacy, then I think the Islamic finance sector in Australia is going to be very well served, and it's just going to continue to grow. It will get bigger and bigger, and what we're trying to do at the moment is make sure that we've got the fundamentals right across the community to make sure that everyone is operating in the right way. And once we've done that, it's a very exciting, I think, path. And as I say, we're trying to make Australia into an Islamic finance hub. So, inshallah, we can get that all done over the next couple of years.
Inshallah. And how can people find out more about Islamic Money Australia?
Yeah, look, probably just go to our website. It's very simple. It's just islamicmoney.au, islamicmoney.au, and that has information about the products and services. Or obviously, you can Google us or check us out on Facebook. But when we first launch, we will be launching retail banking products for the first time. So transaction account, savings that pays profit share, and home finance, and then rapidly going into business banking after that. But it's all on the website. Yeah.
And are you active on social media as well?
Yeah, we're in social media as well. So we've got Facebook. We're on X or Twitter as well. So if anyone wants to, send us an inquiry, they can come through the website or even tweet us or whatever they want, and we'll get back to people as fast as we can. We're also traveling the world at the moment doing a capital raise. So if anyone is interested in having a conversation to us about investment as well, we're happy to look at that.
Fantastic. I'll link it in the show notes after we've had the conversation. But Dean Gillespie, this has been a really fascinating conversation, and I wish you all the best on your journey. And I hope that I'll be hearing about IBA in the next coming years.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Hassan. Great to talk to you.